Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, on another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, welcome. So glad to have you here. If you like what we're doing, please hit like and subscribe. It's a passive gesture that goes a long way. If you're a returning listener, subscriber, so glad to have you back. Big news this week. We should be launching all the video essays on Means TV, as well as other TIR shows. We have some other TIR shows as well. Yes, that's right. Means TV will be carrying all the video essays, past and upcoming, on their channel. And if you like a monthly subscription to some of the best left programming around, you can use the code This is Revolution for 20% off your monthly subscription. Yes, that's right. Put it up on the screen so you can see it. Bam! Means TV, 20% discount code. This is Revolution. 20% off. Means TV. Also, we have something for patrons of the show called The Crisis Papers. It's a new bi-weekly-ish essay series. Different articles on a wide variety of topics. I think y'all will dig it. I worked long and hard on the layout, and it's free for all patrons that are on the Teenage Anarchist tier and above. Issue number 4 is up now, and here it is. I'll put it on the screen. Bam! One of Us is the Killer: Celebrity, Cancel Culture, and the Illusion of Politics and Neoliberal Realism. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description so you can check out all 4 issues. Again, a wide variety of topics. I really look forward to you guys checking that out and telling me what you think. There's been a few comments already on the latest article. But today we're talking about, as you saw from the thumbnail, Scurvy in the Age of Billionaires. Something that, when I was thinking of Scurvy, I was like, what are we going to use for a thumbnail for this? I was like, everybody loves Johnny Depp, right? There's a growing perspective that the Democratic Party's most effective strategy would be to address the economic precarity facing millions of Americans, offering bold programs to counter deepening inequality. Yet, rather than championing genuine economic reforms, both parties often revert to abstract ideals of the, quote, hardworking American, while reinforcing bipartisan narratives around punishing the criminal and lazy. As today's guest, Jeremy Appel, observes in his latest article for Jacobin magazine, Scurvy in the Age of Billionaires. Again, wherever you are listening or watching the show, there's links in the description to the article. It's literally the first thing in the description. Food insecurity is becoming a pressing issue, even reaching households traditionally considered middle class. Appel writes, Statistics Canada data released in May of 2024 shows that food insecurity, which ranges from compromising on food quality to reducing food consumption to save money, is on the rise. In 2021, 12.9% of Canadian households were identified as food insecure. By 2022, a year when only 9.9% of Canadians were identified as living in poverty, that figure was 16.9. This signals a disturbing expansion of income vulnerability under capitalism. Food insecurity, once associated with extreme poverty, now affects a broader demographic, pointing to deeper structural issues in our economic systems. Appel warns, once the scale of the problem is acknowledged, there can be democratic deliberation about how to approach solving it. Otherwise, there's a very real risk of empowering right-wing demagogues who recognize and acknowledge that the system is broken, but will only implement solutions that will make the crisis worse. Oof. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to Jeremy's article. Again, the first thing in the description says, read Jeremy's article here. Please join me in welcoming Edmonton-based independent journalist Jeremy Appel to the show. Alongside his critical work for Jacobin, Jeremy authors the Orchard newsletter on Substack and recently published Kennyism, Jason Kinney's Pursuit of Power. Please welcome, coming all the way live from basement somewhere in the great north of Canada. Please welcome Jeremy Appel.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's great to be here in the great state of California with you.
Ish. California-ish, right? I'm in Baja, so it's like as my one friend calls it, libertarian California. So it's like California with none of the regulations and no black people except me and one other guy. But yeah, then other than that, it's just like California. Have you ever been to this area of Mexico?
No, I haven't. Furthest south I've been in California is the LA area, like Orange County.
Oh,
So
Disneyland.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever been to Disneyland. I think I've been to Disney World, which is the one in Florida.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I always get them mixed up, but that's the one.
Well, Disney World is the massive one where I believe Disneyland can fit in the parking lot for one of the worlds in Disney World. Like that's how big Disney World.
Okay, so my parents took me to the right one.
They took you to the good one. Yeah. Okay. they loved you. So that's what that means. In your article, you cite Statistics Canada data showing a rise in food insecurity among Canadians, even those not considered impoverished. Can you discuss how this redefinition of food insecurity reflects broader economic instability? What really was shocking to me, and I think the reason why Toussaint sought you out and brought you to our attention was, kind of the beacon that I think you're flashing here, where I think a lot of us, if you say poverty and food insecurity, people might even think you're being redundant. And in your article, you go, yeah, there's poor people, of course, but a lot of people that are suffering from food insecurity and rationing, I even find myself doing it, are not what we would consider poor. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. And I mean, I found that quite surprising too when I was writing and researching this article, that there appears to be more people in food insecurity in Canada, and I would imagine elsewhere in the Western world, than there are people in poverty, right? That's counterintuitive, as you noted. Now, the thing is, the way poverty is defined by Statistics Canada, or StatsCan, as it's referred to colloquially, is by what's called a market basket measure, which takes the cost of a basket of goods and services that represent a basic standard of living. So that includes food, among other things like clothing, shelter, transportation, and what have you. So food insecurity represents one component of that. So food insecurity is defined as those who need to skip meals or compromise on the quality of the food they purchase in order to pay for other things, right? So with that in mind, it does make sense, although it's counterintuitive, that you would have people who are struggling with paying for food, but they're not struggling as much to pay for rent or clothing or transportation. And that's because they're compromising on the quality of food they're eating, which to me suggests that the way we talk about poverty is, I think, out of touch with the material reality that a lot of people are living in, because they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak.
Oh God, yes. I mean, we did a show about microfinance globally, but also hit on, of course, the payday loans and things like that. That again, I have dealt with myself in my own personal life. How do we change the conversation around poverty? I think this article is one way in trying to do that, but you personally, I'm sure you have conversations with your friends and comrades up north in Canada, and poverty is a real big issue there. I haven't spent as much time on the east coast of Canada. I've been there quite a bit, but I spent more time on the west coast of Canada, in Vancouver, where there is a glaring poverty problem in the downtown area. But it seems to be contained, and I don't say that in a good way, more of an observational way. And that containment seems to be kind of a project that it feels like people appreciate to a certain extent. From the Canadian aspect, how do you try to have this conversation around poverty and food insecurity when it feels like the state has an apparatus to contain it, to be like, well, that's just the problem of those people over there that are the poors?
Right. And I mean, I live in Alberta, which is just one province over from BC, and it's very similar. I live in downtown Edmonton too, and it seems like the issue of homelessness and people openly using drugs, which I think is what you were alluding to in Vancouver and like the downtown east side, is very much appears to be concentrated in this downtown area. Now, the city of Edmonton, like Calgary, which is the other major city in Alberta, just south,
Mhm.
where the oil and gas industry is based, is very hollowed out, in the sense that the cities are just incredibly sprawled out in a way where there's no rhyme or reason to it. It was just the assumption when these cities were really built up in the post-war era that people would have cars, they would live in the suburbs with their nuclear family, and then they would drive downtown to go to work. But with the crash of oil prices in about a decade ago, and a lot of people losing their jobs, um, the downtown has become even more hollowed out with it, particularly in Calgary, which I think has the worst downtown vacancy rate in North America. Something like a third of office space downtown Calgary isn't being used. And I digress, but I do think it is important to shift the conversation, as you alluded to, about poverty. So we're not just talking about unhoused people, many of whom are addicted to drugs. In Edmonton, 5% of our population is Indigenous, and more than half the people who are unhoused are Indigenous. So there's very much a racial component to that. But and we should talk about that and talk about this absolute poverty. But I think it's important to realize that this is something that is affecting all of us to varying degrees under this regime of neoliberal austerity that even say like me, you have a secure apartment and you have a somewhat steady source of income, there are still ways in which I and I mean many other people who are in even worse lots than me, um, can't afford to live sort of the promise of this neoliberal era where if you work hard and you set your mind to what you're passionate about, that you'll be able to own a house, you'll be able to have two kids and a garage with a car or two in it, and that's out of touch for an increasing amount of people. And as we saw during the pandemic, many people were pushed into homelessness. I mean, the and I know this is a problem across the United States too, but these tent cities within inner cities in big metropolitan areas, I mean, that's a relatively new phenomenon, and it's really it's something that sort of just happened and now it has become normalized, and the policy solutions, of course, that neoliberal governments are proposing for this issue isn't just, yeah, we need to build more social housing and get these people off the streets. It's no, we need the police to come in and violently dismantle these encampments and force these people into addictions recovery. And so
Is where you
sorry.
live? Because again, I haven't. I believe there's a poster behind me. I believe this is in Alberta. Is the alley still around?
The alley.
Under the Mill Creek Cafe, it says.
Huh.
I want to say this was in Edmonton. Yeah, under the Mill Creek Cafe, 9562 82nd Avish is what they wrote.
The Mill Creek Cafe is still around. I don't know about the alley.
Okay, well, go downstairs in that cafe. I remember there's this weird room. And we played a show in this weird room there. Probably, I think that was about 2016, 2015.
Oh yeah. I mean that's like the sort of hip part of Edmonton
Oh,
near where the
okay.
university is, and it reminds me actually of like downtown in Toronto, the city I come from, but it's actually quite a bit south of the downtown core in Edmonton, which, as I mentioned,
Mhm.
is mostly hollowed out. The city gave one of the richest families in Edmonton that owns the Edmonton Oilers hockey team, $500 million to build this new arena for the Oilers to play in. That the Cates Group, this wealthy family, now owns, under the promise that it would, have these trickle down effects and lead to a lot of economic development in the area. And outside of maybe a couple blocks, there isn't that, and it's essentially a wasteland.
So I'm assuming that you have the same tent city problems that we have in various parts of the United States. Like you said, usually in the urban core. What has been the government response? Maybe it's not a federal response. What's been the local government response, and what's been the people's response to these growing encampments as well?
So I mean I think we need to go back a bit to
Sure,
talk about housing in Canada.
sure. It's
So I
expensive
mean, yes, especially in Toronto, in Vancouver,
in Vancouver. Yeah, it's
a lot of
ridiculous.
people are moving to Alberta actually because housing is less expensive here. Taxes also tend to be lower, though the price of consumer goods tends to be higher if you look at the consumer price index. Um, but back in the 1990s, during the really the peak of neoliberalism, the federal government of Jean Chrétien, who is a liberal, essentially like a French Canadian Bill Clinton, just slashed the entire Canadian social safety net, things like healthcare, uh, education, and housing, and just essentially divested the state from social housing and offloaded it onto not for profits and the for profit private sector. And so we're really dealing with, I think, the long term consequences of that decision. And so now, when you see Trudeau, the current prime minister, though probably not for that much longer, talk about the need to build housing, it's always talking about building supply. We need more supply so that housing prices go down. The idea that maybe the federal government should invest in social housing like it did during the Keynesian era and even the early part of the neoliberal age is just not on the table. It's just all about building more homes and incentivizing developers to build more, rooted in this very crude assumption that, well, if you have more supply, right? Because right now it's true, there is more demand than there is supply, and that does increase prices. But this assumption that you just build more supply and everyone will be able to afford a home ignores the reality that developers don't want to build affordable housing because it's
Agreed.
not
Yeah.
profitable for them to do so. It's not in their economic interests. They would rather build luxury condos that people can buy or can buy to live in, or can just purchase as an asset to um, launder money in, or just hold on to flip to someone else who will flip to someone else with no guarantee someone will actually live in it. And what we're seeing now in Canada, which I think, from my understanding, is actually quite unusual in Canadian discourse, is this major backlash against immigration,
Yes.
which very common, I know, in the United States, in
Very different
Europe,
where you are.
especially.
Yeah.
But in Canada, usually, um, I mean, even the last conservative government that was in power under prior to Trudeau, so Stephen Harper, where actually Jason Kenney, who later became the premier of Alberta, the province I live in, was the citizenship and immigration minister. Even they were pro-immigrant. They increased the amount of immigrants that came to Canada, but what they did was change the configuration of immigrants so that the pathway to permanent residency and thus citizenship was more and more closed off to people of higher economic status, people who were educated, who were fluent in either English or French, um, and were in professions that the market was demanding. And but now we're seeing an actual backlash against immigration, and you've seen the liberals, just like the Democrats in the United States do, is in response to criticisms from an increasingly far right, is just buy into their premise. So yes, the problem is there are just too many immigrants taking up our housing stock and driving prices up. So we're actually going to curtail the amount of immigrants we're bringing into this country, which actually post-secondary institutions aren't very fond of, because they've been so defunded due to neoliberalism, that a huge part of their budget depends on these exorbitant tuition fees that are paid by international students.
Yeah, I am aware of the high tuition fees that the international students pay, and how they also help drive the price of housing up as well. Um, Food insecurity is often associated with poverty, yet, as you've highlighted, it's increasingly affecting middle class households. What forces are driving this shift, and what does that say about this current capitalist structure? If you want to speak about it from the Canadian perspective, I understand.
Yeah, well, I think part of it, and I think this is universal. I mean, I talk about Canada the most because that's just where I
It's
am
home,
and
yeah, of
what
course. Yeah.
I know best. But I mean, these are very much international forces that may have different configurations in different countries, but I think we're dealing with the same beast here, right? And I think part of it is that going back to the height of the pandemic is grocery stores. And in Canada, the grocery industry is very concentrated. There are three major players essentially that own the vast majority of grocery stores in the country. They saw it as an opportunity to price gouge, and there's been nothing to stop them from doing so. And now the federal Liberals got them all to sign on this grocers code of conduct that is like completely toothless, and essentially ask them for more transparency, but it doesn't actually change anything. So there's that aspect directly, is that grocers are increasing their profit margins. And they're able to do so in a way because, like, take for example Loblaw, which is the biggest grocer in Canada. They also own Shoppers Drug Mart, which is the biggest chain of pharmacies in
Mhm.
Canada, which doesn't which, like many pharmacies, sells all sorts of different products, right?
Mhm.
And so they're able to sort of use that and say, no, 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 our profit margins are actually coming from this sector, not groceries. We're actually not gouging um, prices. So there's a big house of smoke and mirrors effect going on with regards to grocery prices directly. We're also seeing an increase in energy prices, given the war in Ukraine as well as the genocide in Palestine. Um, that is increasing the price of filling up your car at the gas tank, which also is, I mean, an input that goes into the cost of food and really the cost of everything. Canada, unlike the United States, has a carbon tax, which is also a convenient scapegoat for apologists for the grocery industry. Just saying, no, the carbon tax is increasing the price of everything, even though, and this also makes carbon tax kind of an inefficient policy, but most people get rebates back from the cost of the carbon tax and actually get more money from that than they would have otherwise. And I mean, we could talk about carbon taxes also, how it's this very neoliberal market-based solution to a problem created by the market.
Well, yeah,
And
can you explain just a little bit about that, about the carbon tax? How that
right,
works?
yeah. And so this is something that was endorsed by Milton Friedman even before it became a liberal policy in Canada. Preston Manning, who was the founder of the Reform Party, which ultimately became the Conservative Party of Canada, said this is a great idea because basically you set a price per ton of carbon. So the Liberals started out in 2015 with $30 a ton. And then the assumption is that people operating freely in the market will opt to either drive less or perhaps invest in an electric vehicle or take public transit in order to reduce the cost of their emissions. And it hasn't been particularly effective. Canada has made a lot of climate commitments going back to Kyoto in 2005, and they haven't met a single one. Um, when we have reduced emissions, it's been during the economic crisis in 2008 and the early days of the pandemic in 2020. Um, Now the liberals in the dying days of their, I mean, they've been in power for 9 years, right? I mean, that's a long time. And finally, now they're bringing out all these more substantial climate policies that are going to be needed if Canada is to meet its targets by 2030 and then again by 2050 to reach net zero. But they're very cynically using them as a campaign tool for the election, which is expected next year. And they are getting absolutely walloped in poll after poll by the Conservatives, led by this really irritating, almost like Ben Shapiro esque leader named Pierre Poilievre, who is rightfully talking about how so many things are increasingly unaffordable for Canadians, including housing, um, and is offering solutions that are, again, just like, no, we need more capitalism. The problem, right? Like what we were doing for the past decade that liberals were in power. That wasn't real capitalism. We need more. We need the Bank of Canada to stop printing money. We need um, we need to let developers build more homes, and it's very similar to what the liberals are offering, but with a greater fealty to the market. And of course, a huge centerpiece of Poilievre's campaign is axe the tax, to get rid of the carbon tax, not to mention all these other climate policies that are actually better, that the liberals have brought forward recently, like capping emissions from oil and gas, um, which would make Canada the first country in the world to actually do that. And there's some problems again with what the liberals are bringing forward. They're giving oil and gas interests a bit of a free ride in terms of giving them free offsets that they can then sell if they go under the cap, and people who go over the cap can purchase. And the target that they are expecting industry to meet is 35% below 2019 emissions. If you look at Canada's broader climate plan that they agreed to in Paris, they want every other sector of the economy to reach somewhere between 40 and 45% below 2005 emissions by 2030. And keep in mind that because liberals have never met a climate target before, emissions were greater in 2019 than they were in 2005. So they're allowing the oil and gas industry to cut a lower percentage of a greater amount of emissions than every other sector in the Canadian economy. And of course, the government in Alberta, which is where the tar sands are, and is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry. It's that way under the Conservatives. It was also that way under our sort of nominally socially democratic NDP government that we had from 2015 to 2019. So again, we're at risk of losing even the bare minimum climate action that the federal Liberal government has done, because people's material lives aren't improving.
What's been the response to this conservative movement?
I think a lot of it, because again, a lot of our political discourse in Canada is very influenced by what's happening in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, again, I think Trudeau, who is under the impression that he can come back and win the election next year. I mean, in 2015, when he was first elected, the Liberals were the third place party in the Canadian Parliament, and Trudeau came back and they won a majority government, which in Canada is roughly the equivalent of having control over the House and the executive. Because in Canada, you don't directly vote for prime minister like you would president. You vote for your essentially your member of parliament, the equivalent of a congressperson, and that vote, and then the party with control over parliament's leader becomes prime minister, right? Danielle Smith is a lunatic. She's the premier of Alberta. I'm currently working on a book proposal about her because she is a very interesting figure. I actually wrote a piece for Jacobin, since I'm here to talk about a piece I wrote for Jacobin, back when she was elected the leader of the United Conservative Party in Alberta, saying that it's like if Tucker Carlson became the governor of what state? Does he live in Maine?
I thought he was in Montana, but he could be in Maine. That makes sense.
You would think he's in Montana based on his politics, but I'm pretty sure he actually lives in like a cabin in one of the eastern states. I could be wrong, but Smith is a big fan of Tucker, by
Gross.
the way. He came to town to do a couple of speaking engagements, and she joined him on stage um, at both events to talk about how great it is that we respect the free expression rights of people who we don't always agree with. She didn't identify anything she disagrees with Tucker on. But she is very much, I mean, Alberta is definitely the most American Canadian province. And that goes back actually to its founding. If you look at Eastern Canada, like Ontario, um, it was founded by a lot of actually loyalists who fled the United States after the Revolution, um, and set up governing structures that were loyal to the British Empire. Alberta, which became a province later, um, was actually home to a lot of Republican, like small L Republican, also probably small R Republican, but also probably capital R Republican uh, minded people from the United States. Um, and but Smith is very much really into the U.S. style culture wars. She just passed the most far-reaching anti-trans. Well, it didn't just pass; it will pass because she has a majority in the legislature here. But she brought forward 3 pieces of anti-trans legislature that go further than anything else passed in Canada. Um, banning hormone therapy and hormone therapy and puberty blockers for kids under 16, for example, and banning top and bottom surgery for minors, where bottom surgery isn't a thing for minors and top surgery is very rare. And when it's
Extremely
done,
rare.
it's because
Yeah.
the kid's parents and their physician agree to it. And so, using this sort of rhetoric of parental choice that these right wingers like to talk about in terms of education, they're actually taking away parents' choices if they want to support their child's gender transition. And speaking of parental choice, another very American thing about Alberta is that we have charter schools and are the only province in Canada with charter schools. So again, 100% publicly funded, privately operated schools um, that don't have publicly elected school boards like public schools, and also in many Canadian provinces, including Alberta, Catholic schools. Whole history behind that would be a major digression, but
Are you talking about the residential schools?
no. I mean, there's that. Those were schools run by the Catholic Church as well, but they weren't really schools. They were forced assimilation institutions. But
Mhm.
we also have a mainstream Catholic school system that is fully funded publicly, and they
Mhm.
have publicly elected Catholic school boards.
Oh,
And
interesting.
in theory, they're not allowed to turn students away, like public schools aren't
Mhm.
allowed to do.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, though, I mean, you're probably not going to want to go to a Catholic school if you're not Catholic. Um,
There's that.
and but there was also a controversy actually when the NDP were in power here, the sort of left-leaning party, because Catholic schools only hire teachers who are Catholics in good standing,
Mhm.
which means that they won't hire openly gay teachers, right? Or
Oh,
people who
okay.
live sort of un-Catholic lifestyles. And I see in the comments that Alberta has a big number of Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, which is very true. Chrystia Freeland, Canada's deputy prime minister, who I mentioned in the piece
Yeah.
that you brought me on to discuss,
Mhm.
uh, is from she was raised in Edmonton, which is the Ukrainian capital of Canada. Edmonton is, I would say, for Ukrainians, kind of like Miami is for Cubans, where
Interesting. Okay.
all the Nazi collaborators who
Mhm.
fled communism
And went
came,
to Canada.
and yeah, and they settled in Edmonton,
Mhm. 'Cause that's where
and
the work was.
yeah, in Winnipeg as well, a lot in Winnipeg.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, they settled in Edmonton, and uh, there's a monument to a Waffen SS division at a
Wow.
cemetery here in Edmonton. There's also one
Wow.
in Oakville, Ontario, just west of Toronto. And also the Ukrainian Youth Community Center here has a bust outside of it of Roman Shukovich's head, who was a commander of the Ukrainian insurgent army and massacred thousands of mostly Poles, because by that point most of the Jews in Ukraine were murdered, but also a lot of Jews as well. And these are heroes of Ukrainian nationalism. And uh, there's actually an interesting quote from Phelan, whose grandfather was an editor of a Nazi propaganda rag in Nazi occupied Krakow during the war,
Mhm.
Michael Chomiak. And she's repeatedly, in these puff pieces of her, referred to him as, and his wife, her grandmother, as these huge political inspirations for her.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, so she is a dyed-in-the-wool Ukrainian nationalist uh, from Edmonton, and you can draw a direct line between that and the standing ovation Yaroslav Hunka, this 90 like 9-year-old Waffen SS veteran, got in the Canadian Parliament last year after he was introduced as a Canadian and Ukrainian hero who fought the Russians during World War II. And there's an interesting moment if you rewatch that video, and the Speaker of the House says he fought the Russians during World War II, where he pauses and is like, wait, but we fought the Nazis
The
with
only
the
people fighting the
Russians.
Russians were the.
But he got two standing ovations in the Canadian Parliament. Freeland, who certainly knows what he did and who he is. I mean, she's very well educated. She's a Rhodes Scholar. She's fluent in Ukrainian and Russian, and obviously English and French. And actually, her uncle is a great historian here in Edmonton at the University of Alberta, who's written a lot and is hated by Ukrainian nationalists um, for talking about the role the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian Insurgent Army played in the Holocaust. Um, um, Now, I think actually Freeland is a good way to tie this back, if I may,
Hey, please,
uh,
please.
to the piece in question, because I was actually just a few days ago. She spoke at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress's 50th anniversary conference here in Edmonton. Um, I mean, these are people, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress are ultra nationalists who, while again, Ukraine was under Soviet rule, were really fanning this flame and promulgating this mythologies of Ukrainian nationalism in opposition to communism, just like the Cubans in Miami do. Um, in opposition to the government in Cuba, um, she went and she boasted about how no country per capita has been more supportive of Ukraine than Canada in fighting this proxy war. She didn't call it that. Of course, she called it this war of light against darkness and democracy against dictatorship.
Wow.
That Canada is so glad to be contributing to. She also boasted that it's only Ukrainians who are fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, in that Ukraine is going to win, and that Canada has dedicated more than $4 billion to Ukraine over the past 2.5 years, which is more than any other country per capita. I mean, again, Canada is the largest Ukrainian diaspora outside of Russia and
I
probably
didn't know that.
Poland now. Yeah. Um, and um, and yeah, and she's boasting that we are giving so much money to Ukraine. And then she made this announcement. She said, "This is the first audience I'm telling this in front of." And I reported this in my newsletter. And actually, it got picked up by this kind of hack right wing columnist in the Calgary newspaper, I noticed today. Um, but she said, "I'm really happy. I'm so proud to be unveiling this new policy here to you. We are going to eliminate Russian oil imports, or I guess exports, from the global economy." And it's so great to be here in Canada, in Alberta,
Mhm.
where we are in a good place to replace this oil. And of course, never mind that no one wants Alberta's oil because it's shit. It's so far underground. It costs so much to dig out, and it is uniquely emissions intensive as a
And don't you have
result.
to pay more money to refine it?
Yeah, yeah, because it's tar.
Yeah.
I mean, tar is sort of it's not exactly tar, but the substance that comes out of the ground is tar-like, because it's oil mixed with a bunch of other crap that you have to separate from it. Um, and um, I'm reminded of this discussion about poverty and inequality and people having to choose between buying quality food and paying for housing, because I quote Freeland in that
Mhm.
recent piece in Jacobin, saying, "Look, we know global inequality is a huge problem." I mean, Freeland, when she was a journalist, wrote about it. She didn't write about it in a very smart way, in my opinion, but she's well aware of it. And she said that's why we're going to keep going with these targeted policies to. I'm making her sound way more charismatic than she is, but she's not charismatic at all. These targeted policies to address food insecurity and poverty. And then you see her at this Ukrainian nationalist gathering just boasting about how Canada has all this money to spend so that Ukrainians can die, to make a point about the forces of light and darkness. And I think that is also, we can't ignore that aspect. I think it's easy for a lot of people to sort of gloss over foreign policy um, when we're having these conversations. But again, I mean, every dollar we send to Ukraine. And I'm not saying we shouldn't send aid to Ukraine, and we shouldn't, certainly should. I think actually Canada's programs for bringing Ukrainians in as a result of the war is actually a model that should be followed for racialized people, but of course hasn't been. I mean, our program to bring Palestinians from Gaza in, um,
Yeah.
I, 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 I think less than 300 Palestinians have been brought in. And again, this is a
Wow.
temporary program. There's no pathway for them to become permanent residents. Um, and same with Sudanese refugees as well. And we can't forget about the situation in Sudan. Um, and again, I mean, Canada doesn't directly give Israel money in the same way the United States does, but we do have a lot of Zionist charities that um, are getting tax receipts in violating Canadian charitable laws by contributing to the Israeli military. I mean, the CEO of Chapters Indigo, which is sort of our big bookstore monopoly, like Canada's equivalent of like Barnes and Nobles,
Okay.
right? And they sell like scented candles and stuff too, and pillows, right? It's not just books. But she's a billionaire, Heather Reisman, and her husband set up this foundation to provide bursaries to people who moved to Israel to serve in the Israeli occupation forces, who don't have family in Israel. And I mean, again, this is a brazen violation of Canadian charitable laws, and they're allowed to do it and be subsidized by the public for doing so. The Jewish National Fund, which is an international Zionist charity that sort of but historically bought up land in Palestine and only sold it to Jews. JNF Canada actually just lost its charitable status that it had for a while because it was found to be contributing to projects on Israeli military bases in illegal settlements in the West Bank. And they just lost an appeal, actually, and they've still got other avenues of appeal, but that is a promising sign. But again, I'm not advocating isolationism here, but I mean, when you look at the amount of weapons that we invest in and send to Ukraine, and sell to Israel and sell to Saudi Arabia, I mean, surely there are more productive uses that are of our resources that can be used to give people's jobs and protect the planet.
And maybe help feed some of these hungry people.
Yeah,
Is
or build housing, build
are we
like public
witnessing
housing.
are we witnessing the death of liberalism in this moment right now? Because you're talking about maybe the non-reelection of Trudeau for a far-right demagogic figure, Trump-esque. It's not like in 2016 we weren't talking about a movement to the right, Bolsonaro, Brexit, Trump, Duterte in the Philippines, Orban. There's a longer list, and I think that conversation stopped at 2020 because the conversation was shelter in place, it's pandemic. Then here in the States, it was police violence and identity politics. Well, it feels like the solution and I'm going to speak from the American perspective. The solution for the Americans was to kneecap the economic populism of someone like a Bernie Sanders as it was gaining much ground. More and more people are feeling comfortable with the term socialism, identifying as socialists or communists because of the economic advantages of worker power. We're seeing people at that time, people were trying to organize within the gig economy. There were literally laws passed to try to make it slightly easier for people to be employed or to be looked at as employees that worked in the gig economy, but still covenants in that law that said you couldn't unionize. And even that wasn't enough for the gig economy. They had to go harder on it. So there's been this kind of war on labor at the same time. So while Starbucks has capitulated and says, well, we'll collectively bargain with your union, you still have massive sectors of the working class in logistics, for example, which at this point is kind of where the factory people are in the West, right? Moving products around. A lot of that section isn't unionized. And again, the economic populism model that we got during Sanders gets kneecapped for this idea of economic populism through entrepreneurship and trickle down for colored folks, right? We'll give you reparations and we're going to dump, billions of dollars into these programs, and that'll trickle down to the inner cities. And if trickle down has never worked, it's definitely not going to work for a specific group of people. But that also leaves the door open to the businessman. I'm saying that with my tongue implanted in my cheek, as the model for success and what to follow. Is Canada facing something similar in that regard, where the failure of liberalism through identity politics is losing ground for a lot of working class Canadians, and the rhetoric of these right figures is catching on, and we might see a shift even in Canada.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're at a moment where, like 100 years ago, with that Yeats described as the center cannot hold, right? It is really. I mean, it felt like that in 2016, and it feels a lot more like that now. In the Canadian context, I mean, um, I, you do see a lot of working class people and union members expressing their intention to vote conservative in the next election. Now, it's interesting. Of course, Trudeau is going to try and tie Polyev to Trump as much as he can, and there is truth to that. Polyev likes to attack the media. He um, is also um, 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 Christopher Rufo actually is a big fan of Polyev.
Oh, gross.
Yeah. And he likes to pick on the media. He's talking about the World Economic Forum and all these global institutions that are the cause of our problems. But I would say that Polyev is much more of a classic neoliberal than Trump is. I think he's more ideological.
That's
So
scary.
I think Trudeau is making a mistake in just saying this is just like our Trump. And because I mean, if you look at in general in Canada, Republican presidents tend not to be very popular, even among conservative voters.
Mm-hmm.
I think of people like my parents who generally vote conservative. And my mom's American, my dad's not. And my mom is vote blue no matter who. And I joke that she takes it too far because in Canada the conservatives are blue and the liberals are red. But there is like maybe a quarter of Canadians, 20-25% of Canadians like Trump, and the rest don't. And in order to win a majority government, the Conservatives need around 40-ish% support from the electorate in terms of the popular vote, right? Because we have, sort of a five-party system, but not really, because it's still a winner take all. So if you go by district to district, it's usually a two-horse race, though sometimes there will be a three-way race. But again, you see this trend of working class people saying, I've had enough of the liberals doing their whole performative woke shtick. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Justin Trudeau, when he came to power a decade ago, promised that he would lift all boil water advisories on First Nations reserves in Canada, because there are reserves where First Nations live in Canada
Mm-hmm.
where they don't have access to clean drinking water, right?
Wow. Okay.
And it's hard not to draw a parallel there between what we're seeing in Palestine and what's
Mm-hmm.
happening here. And I mean, same with the Flint water crisis, right? Which I
Yeah.
think Rashida Tlaib has done an excellent job of drawing that connection between U.S. empire and the destitution of people at home. And so Trudeau promised to get rid of every clean drinking water advisory. Not most of them, all of them. And there's still about somewhere between 30 to 50, right? There's still a lot of First Nations communities without clean drinking water, and they're taking the federal government to court, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you saw Trudeau take a knee during the Black Lives Matter protests
Yeah.
in 2020.
Yeah.
And um, again, I mean, there's been very little reform in terms of policing. If we look at Canada's, I mean, because sort of, I mean, police forces are generally provincial municipal
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities, but we have the RCMP,
Yeah.
which is federal. It's sort of like the federal equivalent of the FBI is how I would describe it, and nothing's changed in that regard. And so again, seeing all this symbolic weaponization of identity politics. I mean, he has a gender neutral, sorry, not gender, well, he has his cabinet famously in 2015 after he was elected, or I think 2016 when he actually revealed his cabinet. It was had equal numbers of men and women, and he was asked by a reporter, why are you doing this? And he smarmily said, because it's 2016, right? And yeah, I think this sort of sunny positivity that Trudeau was elected upon almost a decade ago, that routine has really worn thin. Of course, how can I forget when he was running for re-election in 2019, it was revealed that he wore blackface apparently too many times to count.
That was my favorite comment by any
Yeah.
leader in office in modern times when confronted with the blackface. Hey, was this the only time? Is this the only picture we're going to find of you? And his response was like, I don't know, brother.
Yeah.
It was a
It was
wild
just
time,
like,
man.
I think because there were two photos that came out, and they're like, have you only done it twice? And he was like, I can't remember. Which is like, okay, so you've done it a lot, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think that it was a potent symbol of this really just emptiness of these liberal identity politics as practiced by someone like Justin Trudeau, right?
Yeah, you would think, because again, this is on the heels of 2020, which I think is the anomaly. We can't look at 2020 as, oh well, these numbers. No, no, no. Let's just look at that year as a. So much happened in the West and just in the world, right? There's a pandemic that happens in the world. Because when you think about Trudeau taking the knee and having the blackface, that's no different than the people that authored the '94 crime bill wearing kente cloth and taking the knee. And taking the knee is, for me, maybe the most feeble form of protest I've ever seen in my life. That comes from Colin Kaepernick, right? Uh, Getting yelled at by the media for sitting down during the national anthem. That's literally all he did. He wasn't out there with a banner. He just sat down, and he was injured at the time and not even starting. So a guy that wasn't starting sat down on the national anthem. Then, because of the media backlash, and again, I've never seen this, and I hope we never see anything like this again, but who knows what the future will bring. Sits down, and this also should let people know about how brand conscious athletes are and why you should never follow their lead. He sits down with a green beret and says, what can I do that wouldn't piss you off? That's not how agitation works. Hey, mom, dad, how do I throw this tantrum right? Fucking, what are you talking about, dude? That's the kneeling. And for people to constantly look at kneeling as this, it is what it's always been. It's kind of a sign of subservience, maybe some weird form of respect. But that's what the guy told him to kneel for in the first place. So when politicians kneel, whether you're in blackface, out of blackface, kente cloth, Public Enemy t-shirt, bumping Kendrick Lamar, I don't give a shit what you're doing as you're doing the bullshit. If you're kneeling, no one should take you seriously. You should never take a kneeler seriously unless they're praying to their God or they have extreme problems with their hips and they have to sit down.
And yeah, and I think people are fed up with this, and they've seen their lives haven't gotten better, and in many cases have gotten worse. So, the U.S. election is a perfect example. I mean, if you look at Kamala Harris, improved upon Joe Biden's performance
I agree.
among two demographic groups.
Yep.
Two demographic groups: Black women
Yep.
and college-educated white people.
Mm-hmm.
So Black men, Trump improved on his performance. Latino men, Trump outright won Latino men, and he made inroads with Latina women. Native Americans, I mean, who I barely vote, they also barely vote in Canada because,
And they're
I
not
mean,
the largest population, right?
right? Yeah, well, especially
Sadly.
I think,
Yeah.
right, like I think a greater percentage of Canada is Indigenous than the United States, but obviously the sheer number of Indigenous people is greater in the States.
Mhm.
But they voted overwhelmingly for Trump, those who did vote, right? Because they wanted change. They were sick of being spoken down to and told again and again by this liberal elite that they understand their pain and that they care and that they're trying, while again everyone's lives are getting worse. um and um I think you're going to see that too in Canada. I think a lot of demographic groups are going to vote conservative. And I think I think this will happen with Trump too, is going to be, though. I mean, I can say with confidence this is going to happen with Polyev, but he's going to get very unpopular very fast because people want change.
Mhm.
They want someone who's talking about things like not being able to afford housing, not being able to afford groceries. They don't want everything else that's going to come with it. Um, um, right, this agenda of hyper austerity that Polyev has dedicated his entire life to imposing. They don't want to see even more support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. Um, they don't want to do absolutely nothing about the climate crisis. They want to do something that is actually going to work, is actually going to reduce emissions, is actually going to build a clean economy with good jobs. But that's just not on the table. Right? I mean, we've got, and again in Canada, it's more complicated because we do have the NDP
Yeah.
federally, which I would say is sort of like Canada's Bernie, AOC maybe party,
Yeah.
Rashid Tlaib party. Again, they've also, um, I mean, especially in the provinces that they govern, they've, I mean, fully embraced neoliberalism. Federally, where they've never been in power, um, they've they pushed really hard to the center uh, before Trudeau as an effort to become sort of the replacement of the liberals as this sort of neoliberal progressive option, but that failed. And so now they've moved a bit back to the left, but are generally kind of rudderless. Um, they, though, got, they were in a supply and confidence agreement for the past couple years with the federal liberals because it was a minority government. So, in order to guarantee that the government wouldn't fall for a set amount of time, they entered an agreement with the NDP in exchange for passing anti scab legislation, which interestingly, the conservatives supported because again they are trying to get that working class vote. um a dental care program because Canada, I mean, we have the worst public healthcare system of all public healthcare systems, right? There are so many holes in it, and dental care is one of them. uh, uh, Cost of medication is another. And so they got out of the liberals this means tested um, uh, dental care subsidy program for people whose household income is less than $90,000,
Mhm.
which is people who are very low income. I mean, I don't consider, I mean, I consider myself pretty low income, but even me and my partner together, keep in mind, this is Canadian dollars, right? So
Yeah.
90,000 Canadian is like what, 70,000 American, maybe?
So I haven't
Um,
been in your country since 2019.
Yeah. But anyways, we're not eligible for this dental subsidy. It's also being done through a private insurance company, so it's not really a public program. But still, I mean, it is something, and people are going to get their teeth looked after who weren't able to before. And then they've sort of laid the groundwork for a pharmacare program where people's medications are covered, but right now it's just contraception and diabetes medications. And the idea is the liberals are going to run and say, hey, if you vote for us again, we can expand this to include all sorts of medications. But also, it is an actual program, and I don't think the conservatives are going to cut that because people like having free contraceptives and diabetes medications. And there's been a lot of debate over whether the NDP should have entered an agreement with the Liberals to get that, or should have used its position in a minority parliament to sort of extract those concessions from the Liberals piecemeal, because now they're sort of tainted by association with the Liberals and aren't seen by a lot of people as this credible alternative to them. So it looks like they will probably be going down with the Liberal ship. And I mean, I think the Conservatives, barring some unforeseen situation, are going to have a massive landslide, the likes of which we haven't seen here in Canada since
The
uh,
80s.
yeah, since the 80s when Brian Mulroney
Jesus.
in 1984 got like more than 200 seats in a much smaller parliament. Well, not a smaller parliament at the time, with less seats, and he's going to make everything worse. But to his credit, he's talking about the right things for the most part, um, and the liberals are now trying to play catch up with him, and it's not a good look. And I think that these types of optical considerations do go a long way when you're dealing with most voters who aren't people like us
Yeah,
who
who are just
live
plugged
and
in.
breathe these things.
Trust me, brother. I know. I want to read some of the comments that people have left during the show. Tony Red says, "It's expensive as hell to be poor, rotten bastards." Um, Robert Booth says, "I'm in poverty Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. When Friday rolls around, I'm rich again." That is the sad reality of each and
Well, for me, it's every other Friday, right?
it's every other. For me, it's I get paid once a month for the most part doing this. Kind of, sort of twice, but mostly once a month. So, whew, not a fan. IIRC. What is that?
If I recall correctly.
Okay. See, I'm so old. I don't know any of the internet language. So when I make it up, it's always wrong. Like FTW
I
for me
you,
for the longest time was fuck the world.
for me, for the longest time, I thought JFC meant just for clarity. And in my old job, I covered city council down in Calgary, and I would just be tweeting out these council proceedings, and I would say just JFC, this thing that clarified it. And then at one point, someone was like, "I don't like." Doesn't JFC mean Jesus fucking Christ? And I actually remember it actually goes back to Trudeau taking the knee. I was arguing with someone about it, and they were like, well, what do you expect him to do?" Right? The typical liberal
Mhm.
um, talking point. That's just like, well, what you mean he could have done something different? That's crazy. And I think I said like JFC, I don't expect him to do anything different, but I do expect him to actually um, take actions. And this person got really offended and like blocked me, and I never understood why.
Because you took the Lord's name in vain.
And then I was like, oh. that makes sense. I didn't like that person anyways. So
There you go. You won. Addition by subtraction. So, if I recall correctly, poverty stats are juked so that a lot of people who should be considered impoverished aren't. And also, from now on, guys, don't do your internet abbreviations because I'm old and I don't know what it means. And I'm always going to assume it means something naughty, knowing this audience. Edmonton Oilers versus Houston Oilers. Who you got? That was funny.
Definitely. I mean, the Edmonton. I know Gretzky is, problematic now because he was hanging out in Mar-a-Lago, but I mean, he's the GOAT. So Edmonton Oilers.
Edmonton Oilers over Houston. It's a dodgeball game though. It's not a hockey match. It's a dodgeball.
Oh,
so I don't. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows?
I as a Canadian, I'm supposed to like love hockey, but I like basketball more.
Uh-oh.
Go Raptors.
There you go. The truth comes out. Canada loves basketball. I believe wasn't basketball invented by a Canadian?
Yes, that's right. Not a lot of people know that. What's it?
William
Naismith, right?
William Naismith. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. He's Canadian, but I think he's living in the States, so we can share. We can share credit.
Affordable housing should not be part of microeconomics. More of these goddamn abbreviations. If I recall correctly, the 2008 bailout TARP put a lot of liquid money into investors' hands, and they used it to speculate on food commodities, driving up the price of grain, bread, and ultimately causing the Arab Spring. Dun dun dun. That's a great comment.
That sounds true. That sounds like something I've read somewhere from a credible source, but. You
got us on that one. We always tend to meet environmental goals in recessions. Capitalism is there to produce value, not wealth. Tony Red. Here's a fellow Canadian nonprofit. Great spelling of the name nonprofit, by the way. Daniel Smith is a lunatic and should be your new favorite person to hate.
Yeah, you should look into this. She's, a really interesting character. If you look up, I've written some stuff about her in Jacobin.
Okay.
And
I think I read it because we had another person from your hood on the show that was talking about a rise in the right in Canada. I think it was last year, and maybe I did read your piece. Was it last year you wrote that?
Yeah, well, she's sort of a regular character,
a regular figure for you.
in my, but I remember I think the first one would have been 2 years ago when she was running for the leadership and winning, and I remember I was like, this is like Tucker Carlson running for a Republican nomination, right? Because she's like a shock jock who is a very good communicator, like really, like especially if you listen to her old episodes of her radio show where she sort of did the Barry Weiss thing during the pandemic. It was just like, I'm quitting because cancel culture has gone too far. And then she like started a podcast where she was just unrestrained. But I mean, she was talking about how like early pandemic days, she was talking about how like drinking tonic water can cure COVID.
There you go.
And that people should try that. And but she's a very good broadcaster, much like Tucker Carlson, in the way that she is speaking directly to you, every single person in the audience, which makes her, even more dangerous than someone like Chrystia Freeland, who has no charisma whatsoever.
It's a skill sometimes, that ability to be able to
mind you, Chrystia Freeland is also in charge of like funding a proxy war, which Danielle Smith isn't. But if you put Danielle Smith in like federal cabinet, I mean, she would do a lot of damage.
Oof. Speaking of damage, President-elect Donald Trump announced Tuesday that Elon Musk will head the new Department of Government Efficiency, a commission aimed at reducing government waste and cutting federal bureaucracy. Okay, add a good way to pay your friend. I got to give TIR props for running all these Canada shows right around the time of the election, dissuade people from thinking of immigrating because of the president Trunt. I think he meant President Trump.
Well, we don't want you. We don't want more Americans.
Expensive to get in there.
Yeah. Well, also now Canada is cracking down on immigration. So, I mean, unless you're like upwardly mobile, you may have a hard time getting in.
Yeah,
But,
it's not easy and cheap.
But yeah, I remember because Mark Maron, I think, moved to Vancouver recently.
Did he really?
Yeah, or
Did he marry a Canadian?
No, I don't think so. I think he has a home in Vancouver because he's filmed a lot of TV there and he likes it here. And I remember he had Naomi Klein on when she was promoting Doppelganger. It's actually really good. I like Mark Maron. I mean, but he was just saying, yeah, like I'm thinking of moving to Canada to escape fascism. And Naomi's like, well, we might be getting our own fascists soon.
It's like these people and their fascism escapes. Thanks, Jeremy. Interesting stuff from our moderator, Sune. Thank you, Sune. You're awesome stuff. And super chat question. Thank you very much, Deshaun. Too nice. Does the new wave of right-wing populism show a class war among elites? The quote left of capital seem to have a blind spot for populism. What say you to that?
I mean, that's really interesting point. And yeah, I do think that there are certainly disputes over the means to achieving the same ends among our economic elites. If you look at if you look at Alberta is a good example, right? Because we turfed our last premier, Jason Kenney, who I wrote the book about, because his party turfed him, which I'm not a member of. So when I say we, I'm using the royal we, because he did too much. He had too many pandemic restrictions, and he barely had any pandemic restrictions. He had the least in Canada, but for a populist faction of his party, that was a bridge too far. And so they brought in Danielle Smith. And I think when we look at conservatism, Corey Robin has a great book, The Reactionary Mind.
Yes, Corey Robin's been on the show to talk about that book, actually. Yeah.
Edmund Burke to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how the conservative project is fundamentally one of maintaining existing power relations. And so when you have a goal that is that broad, you're going to have tactical disagreements about how to bring that about. But then you look at Trump's cabinet appointees now, right? Like apparently
Marco Rubio.
Yeah, Trump represents this isolationist, like populist America First wing, and he's just bringing in all the discredited neocons like Lil Marco and Mike Huckabee. Actually, when Mike Huckabee ran for president, he was saying some good stuff about the economy and trade, like very anti-neoliberal stuff. But making him your ambassador to Israel, this is a guy who is a total greater Israel fanatic. And so I do think our elites have more in common with each other than they do with us.
Of course. Jesus. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description of Jeremy's article in Jacobin. Jeremy, what are you working on next? Where can people see you?
Most of my writing these days appears on my Substack newsletter called The Orchard. By the way, Jason, you pronounced my name correctly, which is quite uncommon. Usually people assume it's Appel because the name of my Substack. Even in Canada, where French is our other official language. In
Mm-hmm.
Appel, it means call, and it's literally a French word. But good on you. So yeah, you can find much of my writing at the Orchard, readtheorchard.org. I do some investigative reporting for a local Edmonton news outlet here called the
Oh, dope.
Progress Report, who our editor-in-chief, actually, Duncan Kinney, I mentioned the Nazi monuments here in Edmonton, was accused by Edmonton police, and he's an outspoken critic of Edmonton police, which is a particularly nasty, racist police force, um, of graffitiing actual Nazi on the bust of Roman Shukovich outside of the Ukrainian Youth Unity Complex here in Edmonton, which normally it would be like, that's fucking great, good for him. But he reported on it. Someone sent him photos of it, and he reported on it. So they got him charged with this crime as a means of discrediting him as a journalist. So yeah, shout out to Duncan and the Progress Report, where I do a lot of my journalism. I co-host a podcast called Big Shiny Takes, where me and some of my pals in Toronto
Talk basketball.
no, we actually talk about Canadian punditry, and we do
Ooh.
sort of like Chapo reading series style read-throughs of just the worst columns in Canadian media. I mean, the Canadian media is probably worse than American media. It's more concentrated,
Mhm.
it's more right-wing, and just, I mean, the characters that they produce. I mean, you know, remember the dog shampoo guy? Do you
I'm
remember him?
sorry.
The guy's dog. There's this Canadian guy who tweeted about how he's been using dog shampoo for months, because the dog logo, the dog picture on this bottle of dog shampoo was so small, and he went viral for it. Anyways, he's this absolute shit for brains Canadian pundit, who I always refer to him as dog shampoo guy, and people are online enough, they know what I'm talking about. And there's the other guy, Tristan Hopper, this absolute freak, who posted a photo of him curb stomping a raccoon, and
That seems
also,
a bit much.
yeah, and also has these bizarre horny tweets, and has been writing for the past year that, of course, the Holocaust is about to happen if we don't ban protests in support of Palestine. So,
The
I mean, these
Holocaust for Jews or Palestinians?
no. The Holocaust for Palestinians is like all Holocaust deniers. He can't decide whether it's not happening or it's
Oh,
justified.
gotcha, gotcha.
But no, he's talking about he's talking about Kristallnacht happening, tomorrow if pro-Palestine protests are allowed. So these are the leading lights of Canadian.
You said leading lights. these are the
Yeah,
these are the big voices in Canadian media. Jesus.
yeah, that's right. Thought leaders.
Well, you have to challenge these thought leaders. I'm going to keep having Canadians on my show to challenge these other Canadian thought leaders. So take that, Canadian YouTubers that don't talk to other Canadians. And if you do, it's only about American stuff. Take that. You know who the fuck I'm talking to.
I think I know who you're talking about.
Wusses. But yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And I hope you're safe now in Canada after I just called out all Canadian YouTubers.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I got to, as an Albertan, I of course own a gun, which
Oh, there you
actually
go.
is now being added to Alberta's Bill of Rights, thanks to Premier Danielle, that Alberta has a Second Amendment.
And most of those people are in Toronto anyway, so you're fine.
Yeah, of course. The
You're totally
Toronto,
fine.
center of the universe.
Right? You know, Alberta is like, weren't the Olympics there in like 88?
Yeah, Calgary.
Calgary, close enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's only a few hours away.
Calgary had an awesome hardcore scene.
Yeah, I could see that.
They had a dope venue there that we played. That was a lot of fun. I think it's gone now.
Oh, was it that hot dog place?
I don't think it was a hot dog, but it was like a proper venue. I don't remember
What
the
was
name
that
of it.
place called? It was like right across from me. I lived in like um uh Tubby Dog. Tubby Dog, I think, had a lot of punk shows there. It closed down while I was during the pandemic.
It said Jordan Peterson has just been activated. Well, look, Jeremy, thank you very much. Have a very good night.
Yeah, great
And
to
I
be
appreciate
here.
you coming on the show, brother. That is Jeremy Appel. Again, wherever you're watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description to read Jeremy's work. I'm glad he came on the show. Thank you again, Tucson, for booking this one. Awesome. Hopefully, we can get Jeremy back. If you are a patron of the show, the link is already up. And for patrons to join me to look at some interesting videos on the internet. I don't know. I don't dig what I'm saying. And I want to ask you guys some questions about it because you guys give me clarity for a lot of this stuff. So I need you guys to help me with this. So if you're not a patron, if you want to join us in the champagne room and have access to champagne rooms past and present, it's very easy. Become a patron. Patreon.com/Bitterlake Presents. Simple as that. Until then, keep inputting wrong internet terminologies in this chat because I was trying to keep my face straight as I looked down and was reading the insane shit you people wrote. So, but let's have some fun in the champagne room. The last champagne room was not as fun, but I want to have some silly fun ish and ask you guys some serious questions about nuisance streamers. I feel like I used to think that a lot of the stuff is fake. And I still believe a lot of the things they do is fake, even though there have been instances of these guys getting beat up. One guy even got shot. But I think that's the goal now is to get beat up. So let's discuss this. Let's have some fun. Laugh at some of this stuff. We'll discuss it in the champagne room. And on that note, we are out.